Fortune of Ravenscar. The rain had not stopped for 2 days. Ravenscar Hall breathed like an old cathedral, heavy patient listening. Helena Ravenscar stood beneath the portrait of Magnus Jaw, set hands cold. Mara Whitlow watched from the threshold, a letter tube pressed to her chest. I. Hale cleared his throat and called the room to order. The will would be read at noon. The codicil would follow. The truth would wait for no one. Helena said the codicil was a trick. Mara said the trick was believing the past obeys the living. Cassian laughed the way men laugh when they are not sleeping. Iris stared at the windows, counting the raindrops like questions. Agnes Morley brought the iron key to the archive tower. 3 locks. 1. Promise no shortcuts. I carried the leather folio, the seal unbroken, the air too quiet. They climbed the spiral steps. Stone-wet torches, humming with old electricity. The archive door opened like a story that has been waiting. Shelves, ledgers, the safe mounted in a wall of oak, patient as bone. I turned the dial, the second dial, the third. The safe blinked and did not open. He tried again. It did not open. Agnes whispered that the mechanism had been serviced last week. Helena asked by whom. Agnes said the only man who touches the safe is the man with the code. I swallowed the sentence and said nothing. Cassian tugged the oil painting aside. He found a new camera above the cornice, too modern, too clean. Iris said there were no cameras in here last winter. Helena looked at Agnes. Agnes looked at Quentin. I looked at the floor. The power dipped. The camera clicked. The red light died. Agnes pulled a fuse from a hidden panel, her hand shaking. She said some rooms are not meant for eyes. Helena said some rooms are not meant for thieves.
I called security to pull the midnight logs. The printer stuttered. The paper arrived like a confession. 217 motion-detected archive tower, 1 silhouette, no facial match. Helena said, "Print the frame." The frame arrived. A figure in a long coat, the brim of a hat, a gloved hand on the safe like a prayer. Mara stepped closer and did not breathe. She said she had seen that coat in a photograph in New York. I told her to be careful with memories. Mara said memories are careful with us. The bell struck noon. The family gathered in the long gallery, portraits turning into jury. I broke the seal. The will spoke in Magnus's voice, measured, merciless, meticulous. Helena, the stewardship passes to you if you can open the 3 closed doors without force, using truth alone, within 5 days. Cassian, the north pasture and the west cottages, contingent upon sobriety and solvent accounts.
Iris, the house on the cliff, contingent upon returning what you took 10 years ago. The room held its breath and let it go slowly. Mara stepped forward, the codicil in her hands. She said this was signed in Manhattan, witnessed, notarized, sealed with DNA. I frowned and said lies travel faster than letters. Mara untwisted the tube and placed the paper on the table. Magnus's hand, the old slope of his letters, a new sentence that bent the estate like a branch. If Mara Whitlow is proven my daughter by the testing closed, she is to be included as an heir with stewardship rights equal to Helena's for the purpose of rewilding the marsh and restoring the ancient fen. The silence was not empty. It was a storm deciding where to fall. Helena said the test could be forged. I said the chain of custody would decide. Agnes said the chain of blood decides longer than any chain of paper. Cassian said the only chain he feared was the one around his ankle 2 years ago. Iris said nothing and read the portrait frames like subtitles. The meeting adjourned and did not end. Helena told Quentin to meet her in the chapel at midnight. I told her that rooms have ears. Helena said, "Then we will speak to the stones." Mara walked the east corridor and counted doors. Agnes found her and asked why New York sends daughters back to English reign.
Mara said, "Because some fathers never learned how to write goodbye." Night arrived the way old houses prefer, slow, absolute, final. Helena reached the chapel first. A candle lit the cross, a shadow longer than any man. I came from the vestry, the ledger under his coat, the keys louder than his shoes. Helena asked why the safe would not open. I said because wills are written twice, once for the living, once for the dead. Helena said she wanted the living version. I placed a letter on the altar, the seal unbroken, the wax, the color of old cherries. He said Magnus was going to change everything. Then he did not. Helena asked why. I said because love is a legal term only when it break. Helena said she wanted the truth. I said the truth is a door and you cannot force it. A footstep outside, soft, careful, late. Helena blew the candle and the dark arrived like a decision.
The chapel camera clicked behind the rood screen. Someone had wired a new eye to an old wall. The door opened, the silhouette paused, the coat from the noon frame, the gloved hand reaching for the letter on the altar. Helena spoke first. "If you take that, you take the house." The silhouette froze, the hand trembled, the breath became a metronome. I said, "Leave it, and no one will ask who you are." The silhouette turned, the hat lifted, the face entered the small light from the door. Iris Ravenscar looked at them and did not pretend surprise. "She said I put the codicil in the tube 10 years too late, I know." Helena said, "What did you take 10 years ago?" Iris said, "A car, a night, a life I could not carry." I shut his eyes for one heartbeat and opened them with 20 more years in them. Mara stepped out of the shadow of the aisle and said, "I am not the only ghost here." The rain chose that moment to climb the glass harder. The camera chose that moment to fail. The chapel chose that moment to remember. Morning put grey on every stone. Ravenscar Hall smelled of damp wool and old decisions. Helena called the security team to the long gallery and asked for the camera map. They spread blueprints across the table like a battlefield. Red lights marked eyes that never slept. Black squares marked the places the eyes refused to see. Someone had added 2 black squares in the archive tower this spring. I said the installer came recommended. Agnes said the installer asked too few questions. Helena circled the black squares and wrote the word motive beside them. Cassian said that word follows me like a dog. Helena told him to stand still long enough to stop being chased. Iris said nothing and watched the rain make lines of the glass. Mara asked if the fen still sings at dawn.
Agnes said it does when no one is listening. Damien Sloane arrived in a car that wanted to be a sentence. He shook rain off his coat like a man shedding opinions. He told Helena that debt likes silence and that he was here to help it speak. Cassian straightened and then collapsed into a grin he did not feel. Damien offered a letter of intent with numbers that smile and knives that hide. Helena said the estate is not for sale.
Damien said everything is for sale if it is for rescue. I watched and said little and counted votes that did not exist yet. Mara stood where Damien could see her and did not move. Damien asked who she was. She said a line the will forgot and the truth remembered. He nodded, like men nod when they misjudge the room. That afternoon, Helena walked the marsh with Mara. Wind made a map of their coats. Geese wrote a sentence above their heads and erased it with the second wing beat. Mara said Magnus stood here with my mother. Helena said our father stood everywhere and nowhere. Mara said he planned to return the fen to wild. Helena said he planned many things and finished few. Mara said the codicil is one thing he finished. Helena said the codicil is one thing we will prove. At dusk, Iris found Cassian in the music room, a room without music, for too long. She asked him how many favors he owed Damien. He said enough to build a bridge and burn it in the same hour. She asked him why he thought the cliff house belonged to her. He said, because you never left it behind, even when you left. She said 10 years kill many things and hide the rest. He said the house remembers better than people. She said the house remembers what I took. He asked what that was. She said you do not want to know because then you will be a witness. He said I have been a witness all my life and it never saved anyone. She laughed once and it hurt both of them. Midnight again. The chapel kept its promise and waited. Helena opened the side door and I stepped out of the vestry with a folder that did not like to be opened. He said Magnus had written 3 letters and sealed them in 3 envelopes for 3 doors. He said the first door belongs to the archive and is opened by admitting who paid for the cameras. Helena said, say the name. I said Victor Hartman paid for them. Helena said, why? I said because Victor owns the company that wants to buy the North Pasture, and the cameras were a gift to a house they planned to own. Helena said, say the second door. I said the second door belongs to the vault in the old study and opens when the person who drove a car 10 years ago tells the whole road where she went. Helena said Iris will speak when she can breathe. I said then the door will not open, Helena said. And the third, I said the third is a listening room. Helena said what do we listen to? I said Magnus. A shadow passed the lancet window. Helena did not turn because fear loses patience when you look at it. Iris walked in and placed a small tin on the altar. It was dented at the corner and smelled like a drawer that had not opened since summer 5 years ago. She said this holds the key to the car and the key to the words I never said. Helena asked if tonight is the night. Iris said there are only 2 kinds of nights, the ones that end and the ones that begin. I asked if the camera was working. Iris said she cut the wire with a scissor that belonged to their grandmother. Agnes stepped from the side aisle and said, scissors are for cloth, and some cloth is heavier than others. They turned and saw her and did not pretend surprise. She said Magnus kept a phonograph in the listening room. She said he recorded words when paper felt like treason. Helena said, take me there. Agnes said, bring both of your hands and none of your anger. The listening room hid behind the wall of the library, a wall that learned to swing when the right shelf was pulled. Agnes removed a book no one had ever read, and the wall remembered its duty. The room smelled of cedar and sleep. A phonograph sat waiting, a real machine beside it, 2 microphones like patient birds. Agnes opened a drawer and lifted a metal tin that matched the one on the altar. She said, I was told this would be opened by 3. Helena said we have 3. Agnes set the reel on the spindle and turned the dial. The machine woke and the room held its breath. Magnus Ravenscar filled the air with a voice the house knew better than anyone. He said names. He said dates. He said the fen was stolen and must be returned. He said the cameras were a mistake and that gifts from men like Victor become taxes. He said Quentin would resist and then obey and then forgive. He said Helena must open doors with truth and not with rage. He said Cassian must choose a medicine that does not come in a glass. He said Iris must give back a night. The reel ended on a click that sounded like a verdict that refused applause. Helena stood very still and remembered being small and brave and wrong. I wiped the corner of his eye with a lawyer's hand that forgot itself. Agnes said the third door is open when you listen to the room, and do not defend yourself. Helena said, then we have one door open. I said 1.5. Helena said the archive will open when Victor's name enters the minutes. I said I will write it now. Agnes said write it on the wood as well because wood keeps secrets better. They all smiled and none of them meant it. Dawn. Damien Sloane brought contractors to measure the pasture without permission. Helena met them at the gate with a copy of a court order that did not exist yesterday and did today. Damien asked who signed it. I said a judge who owes me nothing and likes the law. Damien said, this is not over. Helena said it never is. He left with the noise of a man who cannot hear himself. Cassian disappeared for 6 hours and returned with a paper bag and a tremor. Iris took the bag and threw it into the river in front of him. He said, you cannot fix me like a leak. She said, I can stop the house from flooding. He asked why she was kind to him now. She said, because I need a witness. He said, I told you witnesses do not save anyone. She said, maybe today they do. Agnes took Mara to the east attic, where portraits went to forget. She pointed to a small oil of a young woman in a blue dress with eyes that did not apologize. Mara said, that is my mother. Agnes said she loved the fen, and the fen kept her secret. Mara said the codicil will change everything. Agnes said, codicils change rooms. Truth changes houses. Evening brought a dinner that pretended to be civil. Crystal stood where voices might fall. Silver waited where hands might shake. Helena raised a glass and said, we will follow the will. Victor raised a glass and said, we will follow the market. Damien said, we will follow debt. Mara said, we will follow water. Cassian said, we will follow breath. Iris said, we will follow what we should have followed 10 years ago. I said, we will follow the law, and looked at Helena long enough to make a sentence without words. The lights blinked twice, and the screen at the end of the gallery woke without permission. A video played from a camera that should not have existed. The chapel last night, the altar, the tin, the faces, a figure behind the screen edge, a man's sleeve, a cufflink shaped like a hawk. Helena turned to Victor. Victor did not move. Damien glanced at his own cuff and breathed again. I whispered, whose feed is this? Agnes said the chapel was never in the system. Helena said, then someone built a second system. Mara said black squares. The screen went dark, and the room tried to remember how to swallow. Helena stood and told everyone to leave, except family. Victor smiled and did not leave. Damien adjusted a ring that hated him. I closed his folio and opened a pen. Agnes stayed because some families need a witness older than the bricks. Mara stayed because leaving is for people who do not live here yet. Helena said, the archive door opens with Victor's name. I said I filed the addendum. Agnes said the wood has taken the ink. Helena said, the second door opens with Iris's truth. Iris said the car belonged to a boy who loved me. She said we drove the cliff road and I drove faster than I could think. She said a deer crossed and the world broke and I broke it more. She said Quentin took the call and fixed the wreck and hid the blood and filed the night under a different date. She said I fled and married a man who wanted silence. She said the cliff house is a debt I owe to a ghost. The room did not breathe for a while. Cassian put his hand on the table because he needed a surface that would not move. Helena said the second door is open. I said the second door is opening, and that is all a door can do. Agnes nodded like a bell remembers a sound. A messenger arrived with a sealed envelope stamped by a lab that enjoys precision. DNA test, complete chain intact. I broke the seal because he breaks them for a living. He read the page twice and then again. He said Mara is Magnus's daughter. Helena closed her eyes and opened them as herself. Cassian laughed and covered his face and laughed again. Iris smiled like a door finally forgetting how to lock. Mara touched the edge of the table with fingers that did not know what to hold. Agnes said blood is a river that never asked for our opinion. Victor said congratulations and meant nothing of it. Damien said the market will not like this. Helena said the house does night settled on the fen and brought a fog that remembered all the names. Helena walked to the archive with me and Mara and Agnes. The safe turned and opened like a throat that had been waiting for water. Inside a ledger and a cassette. I lifted the ledger, and Helena lifted the cassette, and Agnes lifted a prayer without words. They carried the things to the listening room and fed the machine. Magnus spoke again. He said Quentin did his duty and his sin in the same hour. He said he asked Quentin to change a date on a will to spare Helena a scandal about the Cliff Road. He said he asked Iris to carry a codicil to Manhattan, but fear arrived first. He said he asked Cassian to forgive him for making strength a test instead of a gift. He said he asked Mara to forgive him for a country he loved more than a letter he did not write. He said he asked Helena to forgive him for making her the eldest and thinking that meant she knew where to put every weight. The reel ended, and the room learned how to echo. I put both hands on the table and said I will resign. Helena said, you will face the law first. I said I know the law's face. Agnes said it is time the law knew yours. Mara said the fen is waiting to be returned. Cassian said the pasture is waiting to be spared. Iris said the cliff house is waiting to be opened. Victor said the market is waiting to be obeyed. Helena said the market will wait outside. Damien made one last call, and no one answered. He left a message for a man who sells leverage in the city. He said bring a judge and a camera and a headline. He said bring a pen that can write through rain. He said bring a door we can kick. No one came. Some nights choose their own audience. Morning of the 5th day. 3 doors. 2 open, 1 listening. Helena wrote Victor's name into the minutes and read them aloud in front of the hearth. The archive door was done. Iris drove to the cliff house with Helena and Mara and Cassian and Agnes. She put the key into the lock, and the lock remembered her. She walked through every room and placed a photograph on a mantel that had been waiting for it since the last tide. She said the boy's name out loud, and the house wrote it on the air. She stood on the cliff and returned a necklace to the wind. She said, forgive me, and the sea said nothing and everything. The second door was done. They returned to the listening room and pressed play. They listened without defending. They listened without interrupting. They listened until the last click. The third door was done. At noon, the family stood in the long gallery, and the portraits looked less like a jury and more like witnesses. I read the final clause that only opens when 3 doors open without force. Stewardship passes to Helena and Mara together for the purpose of restoring Ravenscar to a house that serves the land and the people who keep it. Cassian receives the cottages and a trust that unlocks with sobriety milestones verified by doctors who answer to no one here. Iris receives the cliff house and the right to keep its door open to anyone who needs to stand at the edge and choose to live.
A fund shall be established for the villagers whose names were erased when the marsh was drained. The fund shall be named after the first family buried under numbers. Victor objected, and the room did not listen. Damien objected, and the door did not open for him. I closed the folio and said, "The will has been executed." Agnes said, "So has a man's hope to do better in death than in life." Victor demanded arbitration in London, and Helena said the Fen has its own court.
Damien demanded repayment, and Cassian said, "I will repay with a life that stays." Mara stepped to the window and opened it and let rain in. Iris laughed for the first time in years, and the sound surprised the glass. Agnes carried the reel to a drawer that knows where to keep the past. Helena put her palm on the table where Magnus once put his and said, "We will keep this house by keeping each other." No one argued, because some sentences do not need debate. Evening gave them a small sun for 10 minutes. They stood on the terrace and the Fen sang very quietly. Villagers came with lanterns as if someone had whispered a time into their pockets. A man brought a map and showed where the water used to run. A woman brought a name and said it was her grandfather's father's father's. Mara wrote it on a page that would not be lost. Helena handed the first letter of the fund to Agnes. Agnes handed it to the vicar. The vicar handed it to the child, who held the lantern with 2 hands. The child carried it to the Fen and said a word no one taught him. Everyone heard it, and no one repeated it, because some words do not want to be famous. Night again. The hall exhaled. Doors remembered how to rest. Cameras forgot how to stare. Helena sat beneath Magnus's portrait and did not feel small. Mara sat beside her and did not feel like a visitor. Cassian sat on the step and did not shake. Iris sat on the arm of the chair and did not run. Agnes poured tea and gave it to hands that were ready to hold something that was not a weapon. I sat alone in his office and wrote a letter that did not defend him. Victor sat in a car that pretended to be a throne and discovered it was a seat. Damien sat at a bar that sells remorse by the glass and ordered one and did not finish it. If you are listening because your house is full of locked doors, hear this. You can open them without force. You can open them with names and dates and the sound of someone telling the truth. You can put land before pride and people before ledgers. You can return what you took when you were too young to know the cost. You can build a fund instead of a statue. You can stand on a cliff and choose the life that waits. You can turn the camera off and look with your own eyes. You can say the name of the person you hurt and the person you are.
And you can keep the house, not the bricks. The home? The sky broke to a thinner rain, and the hall decided to sharpen its edges. Helena Ravenscar asked for a meeting that was not a meeting. Victor Hartman arrived with 2 advisors who smelled like numbers. Damien Sloane arrived with a smile that borrowed its courage. I Hale stood to the side with a folder that wanted to be opened only once. Agnes Morley poured tea and did not leave the room because witnesses matter.
Helena set 3 papers on the table and did not sit. She said the pasture is not for sale, the fen is not for leverage, the house is not for ransom. Victor said markets solve problems that feelings create. Damien said debt is not a feeling. Helena said water is not a market. I said proceed. Paper 1 held a conservation covenant drafted by a trust that did not negotiate with greed. Paper 2 held a standstill that froze transfers and liens for 90 days under pain of ruinous costs. Paper 3 held an offer from an endowment that paid for restoration and demanded no control. Victor read quickly and missed the sentence that mattered. Damien read slowly and missed the meaning that mattered. Helena did not miss anything. She said, "Sign the standstill, accept the endowment, submit to the covenant." Victor said, "You cannot force this." Helena said, "I am not forcing, I am offering the only exit that leaves you standing." Damien said, "This is a threat." I said, "This is a remedy." Victor tried a different angle and called it pragmatic. He said a partial sale, a discreet easement, a royalty for every tourist the marsh attracts. Helena said the marsh does not attract tourists, it attracts birds, and birds do not pay royalties. Damien said leverage will find another door. Agnes said doors remember hands. Victor placed a silver pen on the paper and did not use it. He asked what happens if he declines. Helena looked at the window where the rain had decided to rest. She said then the second system becomes public. Victor did not blink, and then he did. Damien asked, "What second system?" I laid out a diagram that drew a shadow over the table. Hidden nodes unregistered uplinks a feed that did not pass through the house servers. 2 black squares in the archive tower, 1 black square in the chapel wall. Victor touched his cuff and then his face and found neither useful. Agnes said some eyes do not deserve to see. Damien stepped forward with a document that glinted like a hook. An intent to enjoin a petition to compel arbitration, a promise to bury the house in procedure. I smiled the way lawyers smile when the clock is on their side. He said the arbitration clause expired when you assigned the debt to a shell in Jersey. He said the court you chose will not take a clause that no longer exists. He said the petition is a coat with no man in it. Damien folded the paper, and then his mouth. Victor asked to walk the fen and think. Helena said the fen does not answer questions inside a house. They went out into a wind that had learned restraint. Water wrote lines in the grass and made a map, older than any deed. Victor said the land could support a resort if it learned to behave. Helena said the land is already behaving, it is the men who are not. Damien took a call, and the call did not help him. Agnes walked behind them far enough to be polite and close enough to be useful. At dawn the next day the contractors returned without permission and with bravado. Helena met them with villagers and lanterns and a letter that cited breeding season and protected species and rights of way older than the fence. Damien arrived and said the letter was not a law. I arrived and said the letter pointed to the law that would arrive by noon. Victor watched the men watch Helena and quietly decided who they would obey. The trucks idled and then exhaled and then turned around. The fen was polite and said nothing. That evening, a private room in the village inn held a candle that refused to be theatrical. Helena sat at one end and Victor at the other, and Damien in the middle where men go when they think they are the hinge. I placed a single page between them and tapped the last paragraph. He said clean hands are required for equity. He said the second system carries fingerprints that the city police will enjoy. He said the chapel feed shows a hawk on a cuff that does not belong to the vicar. Victor did not look at his sleeve, and that was the same as confessing. Damien shifted his ring and found no courage under it. Helena said, "Sign the standstill and accept the covenant and take the endowment or bring your hawk to court." Victor reached for the silver pen and finally used it. Damien hesitated and then put his signature down like a man apologizing to paper. I dated each page and Agnes folded them as if folding a flag. Damien tried one last maneuver, as men always do when they cannot accept a fair ending. He mentioned a lien on Cassian, and a rumour about Iris, and a rumour about Helena that once lived in a cliff road. Helena did not move, and did not blink, and did not lower her voice. She said the lien is being repaid by a trust that attaches to sobriety. She said the rumour about Iris became a confession and became a door. She said the rumour about me is a tape that speaks, and the tape does not lie for you. Damien swallowed a sentence that wanted to be ugly. Agnes set a cup of tea in front of him, and he did not drink it. Victor stood and offered a hand that meant peace rather than victory. Helena took it and meant stewardship rather than surrender. I packed the folder and felt the room breathe. Agnes blew out the candle, and the smoke drew a map in the air and then vanished. Damien left without looking back, and the door did not notice. The next morning, the contractors sent a message that sounded like wisdom. They said, "Tell us when to return and what to plant." Helena sent back a list that began with patience and ended with heather. Victor wired the first tranche of the endowment and did not attach conditions. Damien called a man in the city and received a voicemail that sounded like a closed window. Agnes posted the standstill in the kitchen beside the rota for dishes, and everyone read it twice. The hall held the quiet like a violin holds a note. Cameras slept. Doors rested. Rain chose another county. Helena walked the terrace alone and did not feel alone. She understood that stewardship is a duel fought without drawing blood. She understood that victory is a house that keeps its promise to the land. She understood that Victor had learned and that Damien had not. She went inside, and the floor did not complain. The long game had begun to end.